It's time for another Keystone Kindergarten. Today we're covering Dawnbreaker, a new dungeon as part of the Season 1 in the War Within expansion. I'm Frank, and let's talk about how you can board the Dawnbreaker and save the day. The first set of pools we'll encounter in the dungeon include many Nightfall mobs, starting with the Nightfall Ritualist. They will channel an uninterruptible tormenting ray into 2 random targets in your group for a moderate amount of damage, especially if this isn't your tank. They'll also plant a Stygian seed onto a player that leaves a dot for 6 seconds. When removed by either time or dispels, that person will explode, knocking away other players for damage, so healers give people in melee a chance to run out. Nightfall Shadow Mages will cast Nightbolt onto your tank, but can also choose a player to curse Ensnaring Shadows, a damaging dot that will reduce movement speed by 30% for 15 seconds. You will also encounter Nightfall Curse Blades, who will hit the tank with Dark Blade. Not only that hits for some moderate damage, but also increases the Curse Blade's attack speed and can stack. Stun should slow this process down. As you board the Dawnbreaker, you'll see tons of mobs fighting, but you just want to engage the 2 packs led by Nightfall commanders. They will attempt a Tainted Slash on the tank, which can hit hard and leave a stacking bleed. You can also interrupt their Abyssal Howl, which will shield nearby mobs and do slight damage to the group. Clear those 2 groups and the rest will scatter. Then you'll be instructed to try to rid the Dawnbreaker of 2 adjacent ships trying to web it in place. You'll gain access to your mounts to fly over to either ship and engage a pack of mobs led by Sereku Web Mages. Aside from spam casting Web Bolt, they will also choose a player to apply Bursting Cocoon onto. That player just needs to step out of range to avoid the party getting a blast of damage and being slowed by 50%. Clear both ships and you'll face the first boss aboard the Dawnbreaker, Speaker Shadowcrown. She'll begin by spam casting Shadow Bolt, which will prove important for movement later. Her big spell during this phase, Obsidian Beam, will split into 3 or 4 forks, and upon casting will smash the tank with a large hit, and smaller hits into other players. If you come in contact with any of these beams, you'll take a large amount of damage and a rough ticking dot for 9 seconds, almost ensuring your death. And don't worry, make the mistake twice and it'll stack. She'll throw out Dispellable Burning Shadows, which does a quick dot over 15 seconds. If dispelled or removed on its own, 4 players in the party will receive a heal absorb called Shadow Shroud for a portion of their overall health, which needs to be healed through before the next Obsidian Beams. In this phase, she will also periodically open collapsing night portals below 2 players. It's best to try and bait these as they'll start small and grow by 3 yards every few seconds, taking up some serious space. Moving the boss out of these areas where portals may be is not only helpful for melee DPS, but can also be critical for moving around Obsidian Beams when they spawn as well. So save critical interrupts for Shadow Bolt when these drop to help your tank move her stubborn ass along. Finally, at 50 and 0%, she will cast Darkness Comes. You'll gain access to your mount and must fly out and grab a light fragment to earn the Radiant Light buff. This will ensure you don't get consumed by encroaching shadows as the nuke is going off. Fly around it and take in the beauty of this massive spell, and once the explosion goes off, you'll be able to return to the ship. Now we're on to the tricky part of the dungeon. You'll navigate your way through the city below the Dawnbreaker, trying to find 3 lieutenants. These need to die as the second boss of the dungeon has 3 stacks of an empowered might from them, effectively making it impossible to take on without them dead. This is made additionally hard by the heavily dense scattering of mobs all throughout the city that will make body pulls almost a guarantee. If there's some good news out of all of this, is that they'll give you some insight to what the second boss's abilities will look like. To find where the lieutenants hide, you'll see 3 star markers on the map near 3 standard markers. The stars let you know where lamplighters are, indicating a safe spot to land and coordinate how you want to move towards the lieutenant, which is the standard marker. The lieutenants will randomly spawn between these 3 spots, but they retain the same spell no matter where they are. This proved to be a slight problem because 2 of the 3 have an ability that positioning matters. So let's start with the most deadly. Death Screamer Ikentak will cast Dark Orb. The mob will choose a target and slowly form a shadow orb to fire at them. The cast will follow the target no matter where they move, and this is critical because the person selected needs to point the orb to fire in an uninterrupted path as far away from the group as possible. Once the cast finishes, the orb will slowly take off, allowing the player to move out of the way and hopefully send the orb out of town. The further it travels, the less damage it will do to the group. If it hits a nearby wall or your melee friends, it will definitely nuke or kill the team, and its damage isn't done. It will leave dark scars for your healer to also try to overcome. Tanks, think about how you want the team to point the orb so that it safely floats away to minimize damage. Ixcretin the Unbreakable has a second ability that you want to position around. Terrifying Slam will wind up on the tank, giving everyone a few seconds to run out of the 15 yards, otherwise when it connects with the tank, it will nuke and fear whoever's left behind. Additionally, tanks will get knocked back fairly far, so you want to try to put their backs against a safe wall to avoid being thrown around. This means the rest of the group is responsible for moving. Don't make the tank run around because they'll probably get knocked into another set of mobs. Ascendant Viscoxria uses a third ability, Shadowy Decay. This one's more simple for everyone but the healer, just hammering the group over 3 seconds with some serious damage. Aside from their main ability, each lieutenant will also cast a random Abyssal Blast to the tank every so often. I mentioned earlier that this city is dense, so on your way to find each lieutenant, you'll come across the following mobs. Nightfall Darkcasters will channel Tormenting Beam onto a player for 6 seconds. This is where all your interrupts will be poured into. They will also cast Umbral Barrier, which puts a somewhat large shield on the mob. What's important with this shield is if it isn't broken in a certain amount of time, it will heal them for the remaining amount left. On higher keys, just make sure your cleave is enough to overcome the shield, or you'll want to prioritize them. Nightfall Shadowwalkers will use Umbral Rush, which slams into your tank. Several of these in the pack could spell disaster for the start of the pool, as they usually like to cast it right after being pulled. Get your defensive ready at the start. Manifested Shadows will place an Abyssal Rot on a player, leaving a dot for healers to keep an eye on. Otherwise, they'll rain Black Hail as an AoE around the floor for the group to watch out for. Animated Darkness will be in some areas by the town square, but also appear in the boss fight coming up. They'll just try and cast as many congealed shadows as they can on their target. Tanks, do your best to pick up all of these. Nightfall Tacticians will cast Black Edge in the direction of the tank, a cone that everyone should avoid. Tanks, they'll also buff themselves with Tactician's Rage instantly, so watch for it to pop up on their uniframes, as they'll hit for 100% more damage, but can be kited since they'll move 70% slower. And finally, more scarcely found in the area are Sareki Militants, who will choose a random ranged player to cast Entwining Threads, which will damage and pull the player to the mob. Pair this with Tachynovo, and the mob will try to hit/immobilize anyone within 20 yards of the cast. They also have an interruptible Silken Shell, which will reduce the damage of mobs in the area by 30%, so ensure this is kicked. Okay, now that we found all 3 lieutenants, we can choose an area to fight the second boss, Anub'ikkaj. Where you choose to pull this boss will be difficult, as you want somewhere free of other mobs that you can't back into, but also has a long straightaway to launch Dark Orb at. Let's recap what we've seen so far. Dark Orb will do less damage the further it travels, and needs to be avoided by the group, and adds Dark Scars for the healers to deal with. Terrifying Slam will knock the tank back with a massive damage, and fear anyone within its area. And Shadowy Decay will test your healer's AoE healing, hitting the group over 4 seconds with some large hits. The only other spell to add here is Animate Shadows, where several animated darkness-like mobs will appear and need to be cleaved down as quickly as possible, as they will all try to cast Congealed Darkness on the group. If you can figure out a great place to fight this boss, things should be stable enough for you to down them and move on to the final part of this dungeon. After returning to the Dawnbreaker, you'll see a Nightfall Dark Architect ready to fight on the deck. Be prepared that once this mob dies, you'll move directly into the last boss, so do all your final preparations before pulling. Once pulled, they will cast Tormenting Eruption on 2 players in the group, causing damage to the players and anyone within 5 yards of them, so stay spread out. They will also usher reinforcement throughout the fight, bringing 3 random mobs we've seen earlier. These mobs will suffer from rapid summoning, reducing the damage they do significantly and also reducing their health too. Architects will also sneak in some Night Bolts between the 2 other casts, and their melee hits are empowered to do shadow damage through Dark Fervor. Keep everything clumped together, and once the Architect hits 0%, they'll run to the edge and summon the final boss. Rasha'nan is actually a boss from the first raid of War Within, and their health pool will roughly reflect that. In Phase 1, you won't see their health pool move too much to DPS, but this can be remedied by watching out for Arathi bombs being thrown onto the deck. The 3 DPS will need to pick them up and walk them over to the melee area of the boss so that you can use your action button for Throw Arathi Bomb. Other players should note that they'll be taking damage from carrying Arathi bombs, slightly hurting them as they hold onto the bomb. Tanks, do not leave melee, as Rasha'nan will punish you for this with Tacky Burst. Arathi bombs not detonated on the boss will explode for a stacking dot on the group, so DPS should split up and ensure all bombs are hitting the boss before they trigger themselves. The other big spell in this phase is Rolling Acid. Pay close attention to this private aura, as it will require you to look at the spell to determine which way it will roll. Once this debuff times out, that player will get an acidic stupor, hit, and stun, and send a wave crashing across the deck of the ship in the direction it was telegraphed. If it hits your fellow Dungeoneers, it will push them and give them a stacking corrosion dot. Expel webs will happen in both Phase 1 and 2, rooting players hit by it for 3 seconds and hitting for a good portion of your health if hit. healers prepare for Erosive Spray, a 2-second channel that will chunk the group. You'll also need to keep an eye out for stacks of lingering erosion that are a result of Erosive Spray going out. You'll want to watch these for healing after the spray has ended. After several bombs connect with the Rasha'nan, they will leave the Dawnbreaker and begin fleeing. For this intermission, you'll have 2 modes of staying out of the encroaching shadows that may kill you. First, you can follow the Lamplighter's Skiff, which will have an aura that grants radiant light protecting you. But if you stray too far from the skiff, the buff will start counting down from 10 seconds. If you choose to follow behind the boss, you can fly through light fragments, which will extend your radiant light buff by 3 seconds and grant you a stack of vigor. Flying ahead of the boss will mean you no longer see light fragments spawn, so only do this when you're certain your radiant light buff will last long enough for the Lamplighter to catch up and enter phase 2. Once Rasha'nan lands, they will cast Acidic Eruption, spamming the group with damage until interrupted. This will cause phase 2 to begin, and Rasha'nan will retain Rolling Acid, Expel Webs, and Erosive Spray from the first phase. Added in this phase, they will target 2 players with Spinneret Strands, tethering them with sticky webs until they leave the area of the web. Once they leave, the player will trigger Spinneret's Web Snap, hitting players in the group for a bit of damage. Staggering these will be important for harder keys. Another thing to watch for in this fight is that if you hit any of the lingering webs with Rolling Acid, it will form an acid pool lasting the entire fight, effectively creating less space to work with in this dungeon's final stage, so keep this in mind as you're dropping your strands, especially early on. Once you get Rasha'nan down to 60%, they will fly away to face you in the raid later. You'll then be whisked back to the Dawnbreaker to collect your loot. I'm Frank with the Mythic Dungeon League, and we appreciate you watching our guide on the new Dawnbreaker dungeon. Keep an eye out for other Keystone Kindergartens for Season 1 of War Within, and we'll see you in the next key.